Phillip McMichael is a professor and chair of development sociology at Cornell University, and is a member of the civil society mechanisms in the UN's Committee on World Food Security. He's the author of books such as Development and Social Change, A Global Perspective from 2012, and Food Regimes and Agrarian Questions from 2013. His current research is on agrarian movements, land questions, and food regimes. And his talk here today concerns the politics of the global land question. So please, Phil.
Thank you, Siri. And thank you also to Tor and Hilda for inviting me, and Ranja for helping me out with logistics. Excuse me. So let me just get this sorted out here. The land grab has been very much on the front burner for about the last 8 years, I guess. And this is just a couple of bulletins just this month that I think capture some of the elements of the land grab that I want to talk about today. One is the attempt by many governments to transform peasant farming into commercial farming. And secondly, the attempt by civil society movements to monitor and resist these initiatives. So I'm going to give an outline. I want to specify the land grab as it's happening today. I want to talk about the food regime as a way of understanding the global food economy and the governance issues that are coming up now with land grabbing. And I also want to then talk about the particular politics of the land question that I've been researching as part of the For Food project. Specifying this land grab, I'm using Fernand Braudel, the French historian's concept of three social times: the event, the conjuncture, and the longue durée. Now, the event, I think, was the food security crisis in 2007-2008, when food prices shot up, and the development agencies were very much facing a legitimacy crisis. And so what happened, I think, was a move to encourage land enclosure offshore to complement the trade management process that came out of the WTO, which I'll talk about soon. The second part of it is the conjuncture, the sort of the neoliberal period in which the production of wealth was progressively replaced by the production, by the redistribution of wealth. And in particular, what we saw in the 2000s was investors increasingly hedging by putting their money into agricultural land and agro-futures as a refuge. And then finally, the rational planning of the planet, which is a much longer-term issue, and within the terms of the crisis in the 2000s, there was an attempt to address issues of food productivity and hunger, as well as climate change. And I think that the land and the green grabbing processes came out of that particular rational planning. And of course, that was the tip of the iceberg, because this was within the context of ecosystem assessment by the United Nations that showed that agriculture was contributing to the degradation of land and ecosystems, and we needed to do something about it. So these three social times, I think, came together in this period. This just sort of captures, I think, one of the perverse aspects of the attempt to manage the planetary resources by going green, but of course at the expense of small producers and the rural poor. In terms of land grab drivers, we have, I'll go through this fairly quickly, we have peak oil and climate change awareness driving biofuels policies in Europe and the United States in particular, which arguably led to or encouraged the inflation of food prices, which in turn led to the attempt to go offshore to enclose land. In the same period, we saw food riots also in particular countries around the world, stimulating export bans on food traded across national borders. And as a consequence of that insecurity, the fact that food-dependent states could no longer get food in the open market, and I'm thinking there of China and Korea and the Middle Eastern countries in particular, they go offshore to capture land. At the same time, there's financial speculation, which I just mentioned, in agro-food futures as well as in agricultural land, and that, of course, promotes land grabbing at the same time. At the same time, development agencies are involved very much in this process of land enclosure, identifying unused lands, and arguing that there's a yield gap between small-scale food production and commercial food production. And so in that context, the World Bank's World Development Report in 2008 becomes... Are you waving to me? Are you waving to her? Okay. I've never been waved at while I've been giving a talk, so it's very nice. Thank you. I'll take more waves if anyone has them. You, sir. So the World Bank's World Development Report in 2008, as you know, focused on agriculture for the first time in 25 years and made a very cogent argument for shifting the focus of development policies towards the agricultural sector. And of course, within that context, land grabbing became part of the legitimizing function also. And so what I want to sort of generally argue is that the whole land grab, land acquisition, land rush, land enclosure, land deal, whatever, however you want to characterize it, had a lot to do with the neoliberal reflex in recycling market problems as solutions. So in terms of addressing the food crisis, which was perceived as a market problem in terms of food delivery, the solution was seen in further market solutions such as land grabbing, etc., which I'll talk about. So states are being enlisted to commodify landscapes to feed the world and save the planet. So those are the buzzwords that legitimize this whole process. And within this context, investors are capitalizing future income streams. And I'm arguing here that they're controlling the conditions of social reproduction in many ways. And I think this is a very important idea that once you begin to capitalize land and agriculture and remove it from the control of the local people, local communities, local producers, you're reorganizing the conditions of social reproduction in both productive as well as consumptive terms. In production terms, you're replacing small-scale, locally based agriculture with commercial agriculture, which imposes a model from the outside, which I'll talk about. And secondly, insofar as you're commercializing agriculture, capitalizing it, and maybe producing more biofuels, you're encouraging the assumption that we can continue to consume in the advanced or the rich countries at the same rate because we're doing it with the use of green fuels. So there's many other examples one could use, but I think this is a very important idea that the future is being enclosed very much to the extent that capitalization of landscapes and agriculture is taking place. One figure for African land being grabbed since 2000 is about 55 million hectares, and I think within that decade across the world, the figure was something like 80 million hectares. So Africa's been very much the focus of land grabbing. Now this map is prepared by La Via Campesina, the international coalition of peasants and farmers. This social movement is the largest social movement in the world. It has about over 200 million members in chapters that are located in more than 60 countries around the world. They're beginning to move into Africa now. They began in Central America. So what this map does, I think, what it shows very much is the relationship between the areas of land grabbing, that's the dark green, and there we're looking particularly at Africa, say, and Western Latin America, where the percentage of the population, 10%, more than 10% of the population is undernourished. So there's a rough correlation there, I think, that's quite interesting. The red countries, like Norway, for example, are the land grabbers. South Africa, the Middle Eastern countries, some of the Western European countries, and then the other colour, maize, I guess, is countries that are both land grabbers and land grabbed countries. So Australia, my own country, is experiencing a rush of Chinese investment right now into Australia, buying up Australian land. But Australia is also a land grabber in Southeast Asia, for example. One little pie chart shows that biofuels has been one of the foci, if you like, of land enclosures in the 2000s. In fact, the World Bank argued that the rise in food prices in 2007 was due to biofuels to the extent of 65%. I think that was an inflated study. Other, I think, more conservative studies have argued that biofuels accounted about 40% of food price inflation. Food rights, of course, were one of the manifestations of this food security crisis in 2007, 2008. Over 30 countries had the experience of food rights, and as you know, access to food is a critical governance issue for any state. It's a legitimacy issue. So I think within that context, you get an intensified concern about stability and hunger driving new policies. So in 2008, there was a Rome summit, food summit, which I went to, but I didn't attend the formal one. I attended the social movement version, which was held in the Rome abattoirs, the meatpacking area. And what happened was that the social movement meeting, the Terra Preta movement, was following what was going on in the main summit within the FAO building in Rome, and we had some kind of process whereby we were able to take our concerns to that larger elite meeting. One of the consequences of the Rome summit, in addition to promoting land grabbing in general, was the World Bank's push coming out of its report in the same year to argue that the outgrower model for small farmers needs to be promoted with investment by agribusiness so we can tap the private sector's ability to work across the value chain. So the whole value chain initiative, I think, intensifies during this particular moment in the 2000s. On the other side, and I'm putting these two positions back to back because they represent very divergent visions. On the other side, the International Assessment of Agricultural Science, Technology and Development report that came out in 2008 after 4 years of study by a whole range of 400 experts from academia, from research institutes, from social movements, from governments, from the private sector. They came out with a report in 2008 which has essentially been buried because it didn't promote GM, essentially. I mean, that's the sort of the general argument that people make. The US government and probably the Australians and the Canadians, the three settler states, were not prepared to sign on to this report. But anyway, the report is a very valuable piece of research arguing that small-scale sustainable agriculture, locally adapted seed and ecological farming better address the complexities of climate change, hunger, poverty, and productive demands on agriculture. So it's a very good source, an extensive source for understanding this whole issue. And as you know, the Norwegians are good at this, and the Europeans in general have been promoting multifunctionality, which is a concept that's not understood at all in the United States in terms of agriculture. But the ISTAD report made the argument, firstly, that agriculture was at the crossroads in 2008, and I think that's a very important point to make, because not only because of the food security crisis and the legitimacy crisis, but also because the UN's ecosystem assessment report had come out 3 years earlier to show that agriculture was a major driver in ecosystem degradation, and so something had to be done about farming for the future. And of course, ISTAD drew up this amazing I don't know what it is, a diagram, I guess, that shows that food production is really at the center of social, environmental, and economic relationships, and needs to be understood in those terms rather than simply as an input-output operation, which is essentially what industrial agriculture is all about. Now, in terms of the changing food regime, the food regime is simply a fancy concept to capture the politics of the global food system. And in particular, the World Trade Organization has instituted a way in which the world food system has been managed since 1995, as you know, by liberalization of agricultural sectors and the insistence on all countries having a minimum import rule, which requires them to import food. And of course, during this period, we've seen food dependency, in particularly continents like Africa, rise as a consequence of cheap food that's being produced in Europe and the United States and then being dumped at artificially low prices because of the subsidy system in world markets. And of course, La Via Campesina made the point that this massive movement of food around the world was forcing the increased movement of people as small producers were unable to compete against these artificially lowered prices in their local markets. I want to argue that we're now in a different phase where there's a land enclosure regime. It's not to say that the cheap food regime is still not operative, but I think because of the financialization of agriculture and the movement of investment into agriculture and agri-food futures, we're seeing an additional displacement of smallholders as a consequence of enclosing their land. So what I'm arguing is that the food regime is changing from trade liberalization to land commodification, that there's a move to offshore production increasingly, and it has to do with food-dependent states like China, India, South Korea, Middle East countries, the buying up land or leasing land offshore to make sure they have land to produce food to bring back to their own populations. But at the same time, I think also industrial agriculture is becoming more and more expensive, rising costs of fertilizers and various agri-inputs. Land is cheap offshore, and so you find some investors in agribusinesses, American farmers, going down to Brazil and purchasing land there and reproducing their farming systems offshore. The grievances that have come out of this process have to do with the food dumping I mentioned and the enclosing of land. And so the food sovereignty movement that emerged in the 1990s around the dumping of food in local markets, driving smallholders off the land, is now embracing the idea of land sovereignty, which means that they're beginning to talk about the right to territory for indigenous populations, the right to landscapes, to farming the landscapes by rural communities and rural producers, and most of all the right to produce food, not simply the right to food, which allows you to argue that, well, if you have an international trading system with large transnational corporations that can move food around the world, then everybody has access to food through the market, and that's how the right to food operates. What these folks are arguing is that they want the right to produce food. They want to remain on the land, they want to be farmers, etc. Another part of the changing food regime is the rise of flex crops. There's been some new research on this. What's being produced on the land is either food or feed or fuel or biomass. It doesn't matter what it is, but for the investors, so long as they can make a profit, they don't care whether it's feed or fuel or biomass. So what's happening is that agriculture as food production is essentially being fetishized, that's another part of this whole process. And so one example of that would be the flex crop ontology, that, as I call it, where corn, which could be a food, is being used either as a biofuel or a feed crop, as we know. And as a feed crop, it has particular social dimensions, which I can talk about very quickly. We know the animal protein diet is much more land intensive than a plant protein diet. We also know that rising affluence means that people consume more meat as their incomes rise. And what that means essentially on a global scale is that middle and upper class people who can afford to buy meat are shifting land from food production as a staple food to feed production for more capital-intensive meat production and for more luxury diets. We also know the livestock economy is incredibly land-intensive, both in terms of pasture and feed. Brazilian cattle industry, just to give an example, the ecological hoofprint, which is Tony Weiss's term, it just gives one a sense of the impact of meatification, as he would like to call it. The bioeconomy is represented, say, in plastic bottles now that are made from plant-based materials, and so that's a way in which agriculture is being transformed as a producer of industrial goods as opposed to food products. Oil palm, I think, is a very good example of the way in which deforestation, which of course releases carbon into the atmosphere, is replaced by huge monocultures of oil palm as part of the whole industrialization of agriculture and the connection between agriculture and the consumer economy. Brazil has this amazing, this is an amazing picture of Brazil. I think this is from The Economist. These are all combines here, and it's just an amazing shot of agro-industrialization. And Jostein at lunch was telling me how the aquaculture industry in Norway is supplied by soybeans from Brazil, and this is possibly one of the images that would be involved. Now, industrial agriculture has, of course, a consequence of dispossession. In India, for example, the number of migrants in next year is going to be equal to twice the combined population of the UK, France, and Germany. It's a massive figure, moving people off the land. The Indian government is busy promoting second-tier cities in anticipation of people moving off the land. The Chinese government is doing the same thing. They're planning to move another 200 million people off the land in the next 8 years. And a lot of the people who are already moving are finding that there are no jobs in these second-tier cities. Displacement is the name of the game with land enclosure. And I think that this poster here, "Who is the state to encroach on our lands?" sort of captures one of the key political relationships here. These people are the state, and yet they're being moved off their land as investors are coming in to lease or purchase land for the kinds of production systems that I've been talking about. Now, just moving on now to land governance politics. I mentioned the legitimacy crisis of the food regime in the 2000s and the way in which this has led to a reframing of food security. Formerly, food security in the last 20 or 30 years under neoliberalism has been defined as delivering food through the devices of the global market managed by large companies and situated from the granaries of Europe and the United States in particular. That sort of image of food security was contested by the La Via Campesina and the other social movements, and the crisis of legitimacy around the food crisis, I think, has forced a reckoning, so that now we have a much more manifest food politics that's going on. I mentioned the World Bank refocusing on smallholders, and in part you could argue that this is a legitimacy issue for the World Bank because they're now recognizing the existence of smallholders, but the way in which they want to embrace them and draw them into long supply chains managed and organized by agribusinesses and supplied with agri-inputs. That's their response. The World Bank also elaborated principles of responsible agricultural investment in about 2010. Was all done very confidentially. So with those principles and the Foreign Investment Advisory Service and the International Financial Corporation, which are units of the World Bank, they've been busy reclassifying land for responsible investment. RED, of course, is part of this whole process of quantifying ecosystem services. Oh, what happened there? And then, of course, Olivier de Schutter came along in 2010 and said all of these schemes by the World Bank in particular and the development agencies in general are responsibly destroying the world's peasantry. Back in 2008, actually this declaration I partly had a hand in writing. We argued that the serious and urgent food and climate crises are being used by elites as opportunities to entrench corporate control of world agriculture and the ecological commons. And this is some of the crew here outside of the FAO building in Rome in 2008. The food sovereignty counter-movement, in the context of this food crisis, the International Planning Committee, which is an umbrella organisation for La Via Campesina and all of the other social movements representing small farmers, pastoralists, fisher folk, indigenous people, forest dwellers, etc. They took advantage of this crisis in 2008 to sort of force the FAO to open up a space for civil society, which was a fascinating inversion, if you like, of Naomi Klein's notion of the shock doctrine. Her argument is shock doctrine is when there's a crisis, elites are able to force through certain kind of measures because everybody's in chaos. Well, in a sense, the social movements were able to do the same thing and invert that whole process in 2008. The Committee on World Food Security, the CFS, reform via this movement by the social movements, which led to the creation of the civil society mechanism, which I belong to, was able to elaborate tenure guidelines which were advocating recognition of customary property tenure and gender inequality. So all of a sudden, the social movements were able to have an impact on the debates within the FAO, the Committee on World Food Security. The IPC, the International Planning Committee, challenged the World Bank's investor rights with an alternative RAI principles, which has been going on for the last 2 years, and were actually endorsed last month. I was in Rome for that endorsement, and these were designed to protect land user rights and promote domestic food security, but we were very disappointed in the outcome because the way in which the document came out, it doesn't really address land grabbing, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So here's just a picture of the plenary at the top, the Committee on World Food Security, and down the bottom is the logo of this civil society mechanism, which has its own forum prior to this meeting. This woman is Svetlana Boinson, who was representing the agricultural food workers and making a very passionate plea at the Committee on World Food Security for the rights of workers. That was the one victory in the document that we got governments and private sector to recognise the importance of respecting the rights of food workers. How that will play out in practice is another question. Our argument in the CSM was that the PRI by the World Bank, the investor rights, was unaccountable and we needed a transparent and multilateral version of responsible agricultural investment, which would be rights-based, emphasising public protection and support of farming, advocacy for small-scale land users, and these were the sort of main principles that we elaborated. Firstly, small-scale land users are the main investors in the world, and the Committee on World Food Security actually acknowledged that. And we're talking there about investment of labour, not financial investment. Secondly, they're the majority producers in the world. Thirdly, they reproduce genetic diversity. Fourthly, the source of domestic food security. And fifth, they're low input sustainers of land as a public good. And we're thinking there of climate change issues. But we had difficulties of getting the private sector and member state governments, particularly the settler states, Australia, US, Canada, recognising this. And I think that this quote from Jan Douw van der Ploeg captures the difficulty of this. It's unthinkable to recognise the importance of peasant-like ways of farming. Peasants are often understood as an irrelevant anomaly, and even when their existence is recognised, their realities are perceived as a hindrance to change, a hindrance that can only be removed by reshaping peasants into entrepreneurs, and that is exactly what the World Bank was proposing with its value chain project. So, for example, the kind of opposition we were up against in the Committee on World Food Security is that the dominant discourse kept framing smallholders as businesses in waiting, as small entrepreneurs in waiting, and they just needed the commercial support from agribusiness to get their act together. The private sector mechanism, this was a quote from one of the members, argued that farming should be seen as a profession, food security is about economic growth, and that farmers need to break the subsistence cycle and become entrepreneurs. So this is the sort of the framing of the issue, and it entirely obscured the kind of argument that the civil society mechanism was making, and that is that small-scale producers have a very different model of farming. It's a multifunctional model, and if adequately supported, that is shifting subsidies from the oil company, the energy companies, and agribusiness to supporting smallholder communities, then in fact small-scale production could be incredibly productive and very restorative of the land and ecosystems. The CFS had commissioned a report of high-level panel of experts arguing that smallholder agriculture is the foundation of food security in many countries, an important part of the landscape, and then secondly arguing the potential efficiency of smallholder farming has been widely documented. So many of you know there's been a rising scientific consensus of the greater productivity if measured in the proper terms, in multifunctional terms, of small-scale production. This chart just shows the relative involvement of peasant plant breeders versus institutional breeders. Peasant farmers produce 1.9 million plant varieties since the 1960s versus 72,000 for industrial plant breeders, for example. This pie chart also always surprises people that small-scale producers are in fact the majority producers in the world. Only about 30% of food in the world is produced industrially. It's just a picture of agroecology, agroforestry as alternatives to industrial agriculture. Now, I'm just about to finish here. The counter-movement to the movement within the CFS to promote civil society, social movements, small-scale production, that while the FAO is busy trying to reformulate more progressive principles, the development agencies and the private companies are going around behind the back. One example is the World Bank's new land government assessment framework that is involved in encouraging land titling for economic efficiency. The World Bank's also been involved with benchmarking the business of agriculture, allowing countries to compete against one another for financial investment by offering certain kinds of deals, and the bank is helping that out. And then finally, the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, very active in Africa, has been establishing cooperative framework agreements confidentially with 10 African states so far, involving private investment, resettlement, and value chains. Their cooperation framework agreement for Tanzania, you can see the terms in which the government of Tanzania is negotiating with the G8, which is the sort of principal driver of the new alliance. Monsanto has an agreement with Tanzania as part of this whole process, talking about seeds and opportunities providing farmers with improved access to markets, agro-dealers, vegetable value chains, and so forth. And then finally, this one will interest the Norwegians in the audience. Yara, the big fertilizer company, is very involved in trying to establish a world-class fertilizer production facility to sort of supply the whole continent. So this is all being done behind the process within the FAO, and so there's this formal, informal struggle that's going on. So to begin to conclude here, what I'm arguing essentially is that the land grab involves a reformulation of property relations. It reformulates the meaning of property from a national territory to a scarce global resource. That's how the discourse is shifting. And it's centralizing proprietary control of landscapes in public authorities engaged in private-public partnerships. And that's the new model now for governments to enter into partnerships with private investors, philanthropists like Bill Gates, etc., to establish commercial estates and value chain systems. So my last comment here is that the implications of the land grab is privileges financial over labour investment, paradox of compromising food producers in the name of food security, compromising ecosystems in the name of emissions reduction, enclosing the future with agriculture without farmers, which is a concept that the La Via Campesina uses, eliminating farmer knowledge. And then finally, we have the response by the food land sovereignty politics people linking grassroots struggles with the CFS negotiations that I've been researching. Thank you very much. Do you want me to stay up here?
Sure.